Thanks very much, Tim. Okay, so one of my favourite quotes that I just feel compelled to include in any presentation is from the head of Trafigura back in March, which was a comment that said, I'm not sure about the commodities super cycle, but I'm 100% sure about the copper super cycle. I think since that comment was made, the market is well and truly aware of copper's role in this global transition to net zero. So as it turns out, it's a wonderful, wonderful place to be. And I'll talk about those assets in due course. Another comment, and also something of a bit more substance really, is there is a little bit of apprehension around the Philippines, which is the focus of our efforts with our copper gold assets. So it's important to recognise that recently the president of the Philippines a decree which essentially lifted what was a 9-year ban on new mining projects. So from our perspective, we're very, very confident about the fact that despite some of the reputational issues of the jurisdiction, the fact of the matter is they have a very well-established mining industry, and the president has certainly made some changes at law which facilitates projects like ours proceeding. So we're pretty confident about where we're heading. Again, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. All right, so the main, I guess, summary of Celsius and where we find ourselves. We have a portfolio of copper and gold assets in the Philippines, as well as a cobalt asset in Namibia. The focus is certainly the copper gold. As I'll talk to shortly, there's certainly plenty of value in the cobalt asset as well. As it stands, our flagship project, the MCB Copper Gold Project, over 90% of that JORC resource is already classified as indicated. It's over 300 million tonnes, grading at circa 0.4% copper. As it stands, again, that represents over 1.5 million tonnes of contained copper and not far away from 1.5 million ounces of gold. Currently, we have a drilling program underway. We also have a scoping study that's underway and due towards the end of Q3. We're very much focused on the development of that first asset as a primary objective. We see ourselves not as an exploration company, therefore, but definitely a development company. We're looking to bring that first project into production. As I mentioned, we've got other assets as well, which include a second copper gold asset in the Philippines, which is called Sagay. And we also have the Upuru cobalt project in Namibia. Very important to note that from our perspective, we have a really, really strong team with a deep experience in country in the Philippines, which we see as very important in terms of overcoming this partial negative perception of the jurisdiction itself. Importantly, the chairman, which again, I'll give a bit more detail, but Martin Buckingham, who's leading the company, has been operating in the Philippines for over 30 years, and that includes a 25-year stint with a company called Atlas Consolidated, and Atlas is the largest copper producer in the Philippines. Martin spent over 17 of that 25 years in an executive capacity, senior vice president and/or CFO. So he understands the jurisdiction very, very well. Obviously, that means in terms of the asset base, we provide investors with long-term exposure to copper, to gold, but also to cobalt. Last point to make, this group of assets that were recently acquired in the Philippines are all ex-Freeport. Freeport were one of the largest, or still one of the largest copper producers in the world. And importantly, they spent over $45 million specifically on this portfolio, which is now owned by Celsius, and we are certainly enjoying the benefit of that historical spend. Okay, so as I mentioned, Martin Buckingham, absolutely critical. That's 30 years experience in the country, including 25 years, as I mentioned, with the Philippines' largest copper producer. Obviously myself, Bill Oliver, who's been around for quite some time within the board of Celsius, so a lot of background with the Upuru cobalt asset. Nene, just quickly worth mentioning, non-executive director based in Manila, very much part of that in-country team that we are relying on. Deep experience as well, not only obviously in country as a Filipino, but specifically in the mining industry as it relates to environmental and the regulatory environment. And also we have the in-country director, just on the next page, please, which is Peter Hume. Again, been living in Manila for over 15 years, an engineer by profession, and most recently came from a project called Tampakan, which was once owned by Xstrata/Glencore, and that's one of the largest undeveloped copper gold projects anywhere in the world. Next. So just some specifics about the MCB project, being our flagship project located on the main island of Luzon. And as you can see there, just from that small map, surrounded by lots of well-established resources and mining projects. I think the main takeaway here, though, as I had touched on previously, was that this is once owned by Freeport, and Freeport spent over $14.5 million specifically on this asset. And in the first instance, as I mentioned, we're certainly going to enjoy the benefit of that historical spend, and that's reflected in our Maiden JORC resource on the next page, which we released not that long ago, which currently stands at over 300 million tonnes at 0.48% copper, 0.15 grams a tonne gold. Over 290 million tonnes is already classified as indicated. Now, our focus is certainly on what we've defined as a high-grade core, which currently stands at 93 million tonnes at 0.8% copper and 0.28 grams a tonne gold. So the asset is absolutely tier one from our perspective. As I mentioned before, what that resource represents is over 1.5 million tonnes of contained copper and very close to 1.5 million ounces of gold. Also, as mentioned, Maiden drilling program is underway. The first hole has already been completed. The focus of that program, it's a 6-hole program over 4,000 metres. The first 2 holes are into the high-grade core, and then the balance of the program really is to potentially expand the resource and also just test the boundaries of that resource as well. Again, scoping study also underway, which we're hoping to publish towards the end of Q3. Going on to the next slide. That's just a quick little a map and a picture depicting the resource. As I mentioned, the first hole of that drilling program has already been complete. We've announced the assay results, and as you can see there, highlighted in yellow, which is the recent hole, the intersection of copper was over 600 metres at 0.4% copper and 0.08 grams a tonne gold. More importantly, the intersection within the high-grade core, which was the focus of the hole, returned results 7.85 metres at over 1.4% copper and 0.36 grams a tonne gold. The focus, as I mentioned, of the first 2 holes is very much on that high-grade core, and what we're looking to do is to ensure continuity of grade, and that first hole certainly achieved that objective. Those first 2 holes that we're currently doing, the first hole finished, the second hole close to finished. In fact, it is finished. We're just waiting for the assay results. I know it says there we're at 380 metres. In fact, we ended up drilling to about 630 metres, and all we're doing now is waiting for the balance of that core, the last 200 metres of that core, to return the assay. So we expect that in the next 2 to 3 weeks. But the main focus, as I mentioned, the first 2 holes into the grade core. So we're just looking to firm up grade and continuity of geology as well, with those 2 holes and the results thereof also being incorporated into that scoping study, which we're looking to publish towards the end of Q3. Next. Okay, so just a recap here. As I've mentioned, a long history with Freeport, over $14.5 million spent specifically on this project. Drilling program underway, first hole complete, first hole assays released, second hole complete, second hole assays due in a couple of weeks. And then the next objective is to publish the scoping report, which should be done by the end of Q3 this year, all things going according to plan. Thereafter, we'll obviously finish the balance of the program, which is another 4 holes, and we're expecting that to be done towards the end of the year, and then we can update in total the global JORC resource for this project, which may or may not result in an expansion of an already very large and high-grade resource. Thereafter, for 2022, The idea being, on the basis that the scoping report is positive, the numbers are robust, we'll immediately launch into the process of the DFS and all the other work streams associated with achieving a mining license, either in the form of an FTAA or an MPSA, which is the relevant path to a mining license in the Philippines, which we're hoping to achieve sometime by the end of next year. Just moving on. So other projects. So number one, the Sagay copper gold project, also in the Philippines on the island of Negros. Again, Freeport asset, ex-Freeport asset, I should say, spent over $10 million, over 25,000 meters of drilling. And as you can see, they've just highlighted some of the historical results. Where we're at with this particular project, we're looking to renew the permit in the first instance. Having done that, which we expect imminently, we will then move on to an exploration program, which is targeting some infill drilling for the primary objective of being able to release a maiden JORC resource on this particular asset as well. Highly prospective, historical results look good. So we have pretty high expectations for this as well. And then very quickly, moving on to the cobalt asset, just want to mention here that this is an asset we inherited in terms of the deal with Celsius, recently upgraded the resource, doubling it in size, over 200 million tonnes at 0.12% cobalt, 0.43 copper, and 0.54% zinc. Key takeaway here that this represents over 259,000 tonnes of contained cobalt, in addition to nearly 1 million tonnes of contained copper. So for a cobalt asset, it has substantial resources in relation to copper as well. And we look forward to progressing that particular asset in due course, which we hope to release some details to the market shortly in that regard. Next as well, please skip that one. All right, so just a quick snapshot there of the corporate structure. Current closing price, I think as of today, or trading price 0.036. So as was mentioned, market cap circa 36 to $40 million. We recently did a capital raising towards the end of March, or early April, I should say, of over 6 million. So closing cash as of 31st of March, pro forma, 8.2 million. Plenty of cash to execute on those objectives that I've mentioned. So we're very bullish about the assets that we have. Obviously, the market is very conducive right now for copper and cobalt and gold for that matter. So we think we're well placed, and certainly we've got the team to be able to execute on these assets and move them up the development curve, which we're looking forward to progressing, in due course. So that's pretty much it. We'll try and wrap it up there. I know we're a bit time constrained. So Tim, any questions? Shoot.
There's questions. Thanks, Blair. First question I suppose you'll always get is, why did Freeport abandon the project and how did you pick it up?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a long history, but they essentially walked away from the Philippines in 2012. So I think there was probably a couple of key reasons. The primary one being, despite the fact that Freeport was the largest copper producer at the time, I think they ended up investing substantially in oil and gas. That didn't actually turn out very well for them. The share price lost circa 70 to 80% of their value. And that caused, as it often does, and those circumstances, a refocus by Freeport. And in the end, there were casualties in all of that. And this asset or group of assets was one of those casualties. They essentially just walked away cold from the Philippines. The asset ended up in the hands of a Filipino geologist by the name of Noel Ferreira. And Noel used to work for Freeport as the head of geology. And since 2012, he's had those assets. He's never had the balance sheet to be able to develop them. And as I mentioned, given Martin's history, the chairman, long history in the country, he was aware that Freeport had walked away. He knew Noel, and it just took quite some time for Martin to progress those discussions whereby they essentially agreed to do something with them. And what we've done is certainly married, obviously, the asset with the cash and the vehicle, which is Celsius. And that sort of coincided as well with Martin moving from an executive to a non-executive within Atlas, which essentially paved the way for him to strike that deal without creating any unnecessarily conflict with Atlas. So that's sort of a brief little snapshot of that history. I think, you know, the old Celsius board, as it were, the one that was responsible for doing this transaction, deserve a pat on the back, because these assets are absolutely significant. They are tier one, and it's a huge opportunity. And I think Celsius have done well to secure them.
There's a question on that, technical question. I know we've got a mining analyst on board here. Given the moderate to lowish grade resource, can the resource size expand a lot? And could you comment about metallurgy? Are the metal recoveries expected to be high?
Yeah, so first things first, I wouldn't necessarily agree that it's low grade. I think that if we go back to the total resource, which on the face of it may not look overly impressive, being 300 million tonnes at 0.48%, but as I mentioned, the high grade core is the focus, and that's running closer to 1%. So within that high grade core, 93 million tonnes, over 70 million tonnes is already indicated. So, and running at, as I said, around about 0.8% copper, plus 0.3 grams a tonne gold. So those grades are quite significant, and they certainly stack up very well against most of the majors in terms of what it is that they're mining in terms of both size and grade. So we're very comfortable with that. And if you look at, you know, what you might be able to do with 70 million tonnes at those grades, that is more than enough to justify a relatively long life mining operation. That will be borne out in the scoping study. So we'll sort of wait till that's done and dusted and we can publish those results. In terms of metallurgy, that's also one of the key work streams within the scoping study. So there's nothing to say right now about that metallurgy. That will all come out in the publication of the scoping. The main point, I guess, to mention though on that is the first two holes, as I said, into the high-grade core. Part of that core is being assayed in the Philippines. The balance of the core is then being sent to ALS laboratories in Perth for the very reason to put that core through the relevant metallurgy tests. So we'll have to wait for those results, but we certainly don't expect, given the nature of the deposit, any surprises in terms of what that may or may not look like.